Now we can have questions. Just before we have questions, I have two housekeeping rules. I request everyone to keep their phone on silent or vibrate mode. That is one. Second is people who want to ask questions are requested to come near the mic for asking the questions. It's Dr. Krishnan Swamy.
Good morning. What a fantastic presentation by all the panel. I think it was of extremely high quality. Dr. Nalini Shah, is just a more comment rather than a question. I've just recently moved to Coimbatore, and I find a staggering number of patients with tertiary adrenal insufficiency, mainly due to exogenous steroid use by practitioners and medical people. So these patients go to some medicals and get Betnizol or Decadron for joint aches and pains. And I see at least 2 to 3 patients every week presenting with severe hypotension, hyponatremia, all related to exogenous steroid abuse. Is just a comment for the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before Dr. Sridhar.
Question for Dr. Unnikrishnan, sir. So regarding the Graves' disease TSH receptor antibodies, because now more and more practitioners are doing TSH receptor antibody, but the assay is not very well validated. Either they are doing by RIA or ELISA, and chemiluminescence, even very good labs also doesn't have the chemiluminescence. So only in pregnancy is recommended. What is your opinion regarding the TSH receptor assay antibodies? And the second question is anti-TPO positivity in pregnancy, like more than 1,600 with 54 is normal TSH of 1 to 1.5. So what is your comment regarding whether to treat or it's may not related to exactly for the disease?
I think the TSH receptor antibody is a very expensive test in the Indian scenario. I don't practically order it for non-pregnant patients at all. And if I order it, it's only in pregnancy, because you can't do nuclear scan in pregnancy because of the fact that the radiation issue, and you want to diagnose Graves. That's the only time I do it. And because of the cost, I generally tend, in adults, I just do a uptake study to find out if it is Graves' disease or thyroiditis, and then proceed. So I don't use it much in my practice. So I don't think it's a great test in the Indian setting because of the cost and the fallacies. Second issue of the anti-TPO positive pregnant lady with a TSH of 1. I think there is, right now, if you look at, there is one randomized control trial which looked at giving thyroxine to pregnant euthyroid patients with antibody positivity. They found that there is some decrease in abortions and the pregnancy outcome was better. But when you looked at the TSH in the patients whose outcome was better, the TSH was between 2.5 to 4. So somebody whose TSH is 1 or 0.8 and TPO is positive, I don't think there is any evidence to treat that patient. Maybe follow up if the TSH goes to above 2.5, and if the pregnancy is a precious one. Of course, every pregnancy is precious. Then you might enter treating.
Dr. Krishnan.
Dr. Nalini, every time I hear you talk about Cushing's, I think I should send all my patients to you. But I have a question. What is the experience with vasopressin in the IPSS? Because CRH is pretty much all practical, not available. We've started doing vasopressin, and do you feel that that is comparable?
I think, let me just kind of go through the whole chronology. I would say managing Cushing setup demands that you must have IPSS as a technique being set up, and I think that is a must to have as in your armamentarium. And just basal IPSS per se falls short in maybe 30% of patients. You cannot afford to do such an intense test and not give an answer to 30% of your patients. So CRH, which is such a major challenge, and we just kind of run around the whole world and source from one source, which is so expensive, that I would think, yes, vasopressin, if it is available and you're able to use it, I would do that. I wouldn't A, not do IPSS, and B, do it just without any stim. So yes, the answer would be work with.
Thank you. I mean, I'm absolutely in love with the way you speak, and this is a very, very heartfelt comment. Thanks.
Dr. Kumar.
Just one question to Dr. Unnikrishnan, please. In Graves in pregnancy, we all try to do minimum PTU to maintain free T4 in the upper normal range. What to do with sometimes the free T3 is well above normal range, but free T4 in the upper normal range? Would you like to bring it down within normal limits? If you try to do that, the free T4 go to the mid-normal range. So that's a bit of a, yeah.
I completely agree with that. I think in the case I showed, PTU was given, right now the new guidelines say that you give PTU in the first trimester and carbamazole in the second and third trimester. But this patient was treated early on. So generally that is the way one approaches. The second comment is well taken. If somebody whose free T4 is in the upper half of the normal range and the patient is clinically euthyroid, I would try to keep the patient like that rather than try to aggressively bring down. There is little evidence that a slight degree of thyrotoxicosis is detrimental in pregnancy. A slight degree of hypothyroidism also isn't very detrimental except for the fetal IQ issue, which is little blown out of proportion because of aggressive thyroxine kind of papers. But I think a little bit of thyrotoxicosis doesn't do much harm. Free T4 in the upper part of the normal range, patient stable thyroid clinically, I would just give it like that.
Talabadi? Yes, madam.
Would you allow me to make?
Yes, madam.
I would chase free T3. It's such a hard thing to do in life. You chase free T3, you make free T4 way down in the range, which is totally undesirable. And I would kind of sit on free T4 being my upper quartile.
Dr. Talabadi?
Just to add to that, free T3 has absolutely no role in pregnancy. The reason is because the baby takes the mother's T4, converts it into T3 in the baby's pituitary, and that's how the baby's fetal development does. And the pregnancy, the dynamics are such that whatever T4 is there, it's converted to reverse T3 rather than T3. So T3 has absolutely, or free T3 has no role in pregnancy. So I generally don't do it. T4 up part of normal range, and I would leave it there.
Dr. Talabadi?
My question is to Professor Thomas. Actually, we know that we are doing red proton cogene as well as these SDH mutations. Whether this menin gene has been done in Vellore, and if so, because we have quite a few number of patients. Suppose we want to do the menin gene get tested there, what is the
We are
process?
not doing the M1 gene, the MEN1 gene at this particular point of time. We're just setting up the platform. I told you the logistics involved in this are a little more complex. Particularly, the chance of mismutations extra are much greater. So we are still working on that platform. It was obviously, for our scientists, far easier to work on the red proton oncogene and the STH mutations, as well as multiple lindogene for FIOS and MEN2. But this is proving to be more of a challenge. And I think it's important to be broad spectrum. So the issues of, just taking it to the other, we are going through a phase of change in genetic screening now. So what is traditionally used is something called Sanger screening. And now we're going in for next generation sequencing. So the issue is whether we should be utilizing these techniques also for MEN1 is a question that we are asking ourselves.
Yes, madam.
I am a practicing physician. I have a lab machine that is E411 Roche, that is the electrochemiluminescence machines. That's the latest one. I am doing regular thyroid. I have been treating many years hypothyroid patients. I come across many times, and for one example, recently last week, I had a patient. Her mother is a hypothyroid patient. Of course, in her husband family, all her husband, mother-in-law, his brother, all of them are hypothyroid patients. Almost both the families, they are my patients. So this woman, she's a 27 years old woman. She had already given birth to 2 children. Her last childbirth was 2.5 years. And she came with me. She was looking at typical hypothyroid patients. And she had complaints of severe body ache and then mild pedal edema on both sides, which was non-pitting. And then she was severe constipation and high periods. So when I did a thyroid function for her, of course, she also came in an empty stomach, knowingly from the family. So I did a thyroid function for her T3, T4, TSH. Her T3 was 82, her T4 was 7.5, and her TSH was 2.5. So after seeing that, I thought, let me do a FT4 for her. So I did an FT4. which was 1.22. So with the clinical picture of a typical hypothyroid, and she's sleeping all the time during daytime. How to proceed like this? Similar picture I get frequently.
I think there are two answers to the question. Now, supposing somebody has a normal thyroid function and severe symptoms of hypothyroidism, studies have shown that treating doesn't make a difference to the outcome, to the quality of life or the outcome. So, if the thyroid function test is normal, despite very severe hypothyroidism, there is no evidence to treatment. Having said that, there are two things you could consider. One is the T4 is on the low side and the TSH is normal. That picture could be a central hypothyroidism and maybe a secondary hypothyroidism. Sometimes the TSH is normal because the TSH produced may be bioinactive, so some sort of a secondary hypothyroidism, pituitary tumor situation you could consider. The second situation is you can have something called a hook effect. Since you run a lab, you may be aware of the hook effect with brucellosis, prozone phenomenon, high antibody titers resulting in a low titer when the assay is performed. Same thing can happen in sandwich immunoassays, where you have very large amounts of TSH. One TSH may bind to a signal antibody, the other TSH may bind to a surface antibody, and therefore less number of TSH may bind to both the signal and the surface antibody. So less number of TSH may be sandwiched and therefore detectable. And high amounts of TSH can interfere with this assay. So the way to overcome that assay is to perform this assay in dilution. That means in 1/10 or 1/50 dilution, you re-perform the assay so that you dilute and perform it, you may get a hypothyroidism coming up. This has been noted, especially with prolactomas. I've also published it in Urology India, but it has been noted with TSH and many other chemiluminescent hormones. But if you've done everything is normal, patient is hypothyroid, I would say that's probably not hypothyroidism. Tissue hypothyroidism doesn't seem to respond to thyroxine.
Just take last two quick questions from Santosh.
There's a question to Dr. Nalini. What is the protocol in your institution to work up cases of Cushing's, both the hormone dynamics as well as the imaging in patients with renal failure? And one more question to Dr. Nehal. What about patients for growth hormone for after glucose challenge? Patients who are having hypoglycemia as well as extreme degrees of hyperglycemia.
I think in a patient who's got renal failure, renal impairment, and you're suspecting a Cushing, I think that there are certain dynamics which sort of change and make things very, very complicated. So like your urinary free cortisol, if your GFR has really fallen, say like less than 30 or 40, you are not going to have UFC matching up to your endogenous state of hypercortisolism. So UFC will become kind of not usable as a parameter. Dexamethasone metabolism can also change in these patients. So dexamethasone test kind of goes out. Diurnal rhythm would be the only thing that you could work with. And late night salivary cortisol, so whatever, whether it's a midnight serum cortisol or late night salivary cortisol, if you have it as a diurnal rhythm, that's the only test that I might be able to work with. ACTH, depending upon the degree of stress and so on, will also become a challenge in its interpretation, and I would be very careful to figure out if I'm having a problem. If the renal impairment is severe, contrast MRI also becomes a major concern in these patients because they can sort of pack up their kidneys very badly. And without a contrast MRI to go on to detect a microadenoma, things become extraordinarily difficult, but they're per se so very challenging. So if I'm not able to do a MRI with contrast, if I have a larger tumor, it is visible, fine. Otherwise, I may not be able to even figure out an imaging diagnosis. So I think I'll only be able to work in terms of quantum of test, just the diurnal rhythm-based test, and in terms of imaging, without contrast, if I'm able to see a larger tumor. If I can't do both, I'll simply keep patient under follow-up and see how the patient's clinical picture progresses and how severe does he or she mount up the other additional signs of Cushing for me to kind of consider the interference. If I can't make out between all of these, I will quickly run a plain CT of abdomen, because you'd never miss an adrenal Cushing on a CT. They are very large lesions by that time, really speaking. So if I've shut off my adrenal as a chapter and I've still kept my pituitary open and I don't know what I'm dealing with, I will keep patient under follow-up and then figure it out on follow-up. That would be the way forward for me.
Thanks.
Thank you for that question. So your question was, if you have a patient who has either very high blood sugars or hypoglycemia, or both fluctuating on one pole to the other, how would you do a glucose provocation or a glucose challenge test for their growth hormone levels to be measured? So by and large, most of the, your situation is probably more hypothetical than absolute, because most of the acromegalics that we do see are those who have borderline diabetes once they come to us or when we've actually treated them. The growth hormone levels, when they are extremely high, say in the range of 30s or 40s, it's more of an academic purpose to actually do the glucose suppression test at that point of time. However, all said and done, being an endocrinologist, you are aware of the important links between the hypothalamo-pituitary hepatic axis for growth hormone and IGF-1. Therefore, it would be prudent, because of the chronic effects of hypoglycemia, to control the sugars adequately and then do a glucose challenge test if they are having uncontrolled diabetes. That would be the best and most appropriate things to do. The second situation about hypoglycemia, the coincidence of hypoglycemia, of insulinoma with growth hormone producing tumor, is a rare entity. So really speaking, I wouldn't think too much of it, but once again, the same principle probably works out, is that try and make sure that there's a reasonable homeostasis of glucose round the clock, either with diazoxide or with a glucose infusion, and then do your challenge test at that particular point of time. But how long you should wait, that's anybody's guess.
Last question for this session, please.
I am Suresh from Palakkad. Question is to Unnikrishnan sir. Sir, we miss you after you shifted to Hyderabad. One question is, we have to change from PTU to carbimazole or methimazole the second trimester. What is the factor of conversion? Is there any factor? Second question, sir. Is there any difference between the endogenous and exogenous thyroid hormone regarding the lipid metabolism? We substitute thyroxine after surgery.
Well, I think the first question is whether there is a formula to convert T4 for...
PTU to thyroxine or carbimazole.
Okay.
And is there a PTU hepatotoxicity? Is it very common?
Okay, I think the first thing is that you multiply it by approximately 10, 5 mg of carbimazole is about 50 mg of PTU, that is approximate. 30 mg of carbimazole, 40 mg of carbimazole equal to 30 mg of methimazole, and about, you multiply it by about 10 and you get the dose of PTU required. Second thing is, I don't think PTU hepatotoxicity is such a big thing, but there has been a black box warning with PTU in the US, and therefore we are a little careful. I haven't seen it, it's not a big problem. And what was the third issue?
Lipid metabolism.
Endogenous versus exogenous thyroxine. Well, this was an article published by Dr. S.K. Singh in the Thyroid Research and Practice journal, which I edit. So he has done, one of his PG students had done hypothyroid patients treated with thyroxine. What happens to their lipid profile? Hyperthyroid patients treated with antithyroid drugs. What happened to lipid profile? So in one you had exogenous thyroxine, the other you had an endogenous lowering of thyroxine, and he found that there was absolutely no difference in the pattern of lipid profile movement with an exogenous or an endogenous. It was virtually the same. In fact, as the lipid profiles came down, the HDL also came down a little bit. So that was what was noted in that study. I haven't seen any other study on this topic. Interesting question.
Thank you. We are running out of time. We can discuss with Dr. Unnikrishnan. I thank the speakers and the audience for an excellent interactive session. Thank you.